anyone that knows myself knows I come from Champaign, and I work with Dr. Fred Below. So a lot of people know Dr. Below, high yield corn and soybean. I remember talking with Stephanie about the topic for today and high yield and inputs, but I don't remember if we ever settled on a title until the announcement came out. And anyone that's heard myself or Dr. Below speak knows we have a famous line we like to use, right? Our job is to show you what's possible, and then we always get the question, but did it pay? And we can say, well, we're biologists. The economists can figure that one out. But today I don't get to use my card, Stephanie, because our topic is, low commodity market. But I think it's important to acknowledge that, go through it. So please feel free to interrupt me. We're here for you, your questions. We've got some things we're going to go through. Where are yields coming from? A good reminder. So we're the crop physiology program. So physiology is how the plants grow, develop, and ultimately how you get your yield. And some of the areas I think we can focus on to preserve yield, number one, and then maybe get a few more bushels on top of that. So going through that, for anyone that doesn't know, we do have a website, crophysiology.cropsci.illinois.edu, right? And then we do things like your standard hybrid testing reports. We have soybean variety management. The last 2 years, we've turned that into a planting date study instead of multiple varieties across the state. We're going to talk about why that is. And working on getting a site out here in Western Illinois, because just as Abigail said, it's just as long as Illinois is north to south, it's almost as wide. And understanding East Central Champaign County is not the same as over here. That's standard, right? Every university has a variety in hybrid studies. We've also been in the biological space, right? That's exploded. That was actually 2 years ago, the first thing I talked about out here. That's a whole new market in itself, and we're not really going to go into that today. But we're publicly testing biological products and then putting that information out there, corn and soybean. We do have a project this year with the United Soybean Board, 10 biologicals on 2 soybeans varieties across the state. So that'll all be public information. So this is where you can go to find some of what we're doing on. I manage the website, unfortunately, so I try to keep it as up-to-date as I can in our spare time, which we never seem to have enough. But the other thing I want to show you, when I have data, I think it's important you know where it's coming from. We do small plots, and that's 10 foot wide by 40 foot long. Here's an example of our Washington County site. So if you see numbers from me today, that's the perspective. We are working on scaling that up, strip till or on-farm type work. But it is important, I think, for you to know where those numbers come from, what type of research we're running on that. And the Soybean Association is really scaling up some on-farm stuff that'll help, what can we get at the small plot that they can then take the top stuff to the large plot and get some more realistic, real-world scenarios. So this is what we do, the research side. So getting back to today's topic, right, I got a nice photo of me when I was maybe, it was a good day, smiling for the camera right there, right, nice clean headshot. And this is maybe a couple years ago when we had something like high yields, high prices. It's a really good year for a researcher, just as it is for the farmer. When the commodity prices are good and the yields are good, a lot of that feeds back to the research, so we're all really happy. And then, like I said, I got this topic today, and, it's been a weird season. Over here it's been pretty good. I can tell you other parts of the states had some really interesting climate, and we got low prices, right? So it's a little stressful right there. Start losing the hair. What can we do? How do we maybe navigate moving forward? Now, obviously today, it's the end of July. There's not much we can do at this point on increasing more yield. Anything after today is yield preservation. We'll talk about that. But we are going to go back a little bit, because anywhere you're probably growing corn this year, you're probably going to put beans in the ground next year. So I've got some things to consider that I think are low-hanging fruit to get a little more bushels with maybe not increasing the cost come planting time. So it all starts with yield, right? Everything comes down to yield. Here's the average soybean yield. Bounces up and down, right, every time you get a weather event, things like that. But on average, we're increasing about 0.4 bushels per acre per year. Yields are going up, but you're on the same fields, the same soils. And understanding we're asking more out of our fields and soils every year, and how do we supply that, maintain that, and increase that if we want this line to continue. So about half a bushel per acre per year is the average yield increase. And that's where I say we kind of come down to the title of today is maintaining yield in a low commodity market. So maintaining yield implies you had yield potential to start with. And that's an important thing to remind ourselves is how do we set the bar, and then how do you go through the finish line to make sure you achieve that. And it's this simple yield algorithm, right? I'm a biologist because I didn't want to do math. I started in engineering and got out of that real fast. And I get biology and still some math. But happily, it's a little simpler, right? Pretty easy. Soybean yields, pods per acre. It's not seed per acre necessarily, because the darn things branch, right, and different seeds per pod. But pods per acre, seeds per pod, and then weight per seed. So if you're going to increase your yield, which of these do you maybe have the most control over? And that's where we're going to try and push it. Right? So do we think it's pod number, seeds per pod, or weight per seed? If we're going to increase yield, which one are we going to increase the most?
Pods.
Pods. Good. I think my job's done. I've already got it. Exactly that, right? So I do put on here weight per seed, sort of. We'll talk about why, right? Fungicide, with or without, we'll have heavier seed, things like that. But this is what we're managing. Seed per pod is largely genetic base. You really won't change that. Maybe some high scenario management, so we get those 4 or 5 bean pods on there. So I'm going to show you a regression chart that shows how correlated these are to yield, just to prove that I put the boxes in the right spot. And so this was at 1,258 data points. You got seed number per area versus yield. Sure enough, you increase seed number, yield goes up. And then that 0.78 means it's highly connected, and it's really tight around that line. So this tells us when we have higher yields, it basically means we have more seeds out there, more pods. On the seed weight side, it's very similar, but not quite the same. The first thing you'll notice, it's bigger distribution. It's not as narrow, not as strong. And then 0.29 there. This means that really ultimately seed number is the biggest thing driving yield. Seed weight is kind of the second thing coming through. So how do we manage seed number, pod number? That's the goal. Get more seeds, more pods out there, more seeds to get to yield. And that's building that yield potential. So the question I have is, how do we get to the right start? One of the things I don't have any data on, I don't think there's much out there, right? But when we talk about planting and corn, what do we know? Uniform depth, uniform spacing. That's where corn yield starts. How often do we talk about uniform depth and uniform spacing on soybean? We don't do too much of that, right? Maybe some of the higher technology planters that we now have the monitors that give us the singulation and things like that. Starting to. We always talk about it on corn. We really don't talk about it much on soybean, though, and I think we're missing something there. And I'm just curious, what depth are you all putting your soybean at, roughly, if you're willing to say that next to your neighbors? Inch and a half. All right, that's good to hear. How many are comfortable going 1.75 or 2? Okay, I got some hands in the air. So I work, on some clay soils or some high organic matter soils in there, and some people get afraid at below 1.5 inches. I have a student, I struggle. I put his trials in at 1.75, and it took him about 2 weeks to talk to me, and then it came up just fine. But I think uniform depth, better genetics, better seed treatments, getting that soybean seed off to a good start, I'm going to say is worth a couple bushel, 2-3 bushels, just by a little deeper, a little more uniform, consistent. Why this is really important, how many of you put beans in April this year? And how many years past, is that a normal thing? Maybe end of April, but what about the first 2 weeks of April? Okay, I'm happy to see that, and so you've picked up on some stuff that the rest of the state's still catching up on, especially, Champaign County. Corn first has typically been everything, and the beans go in May. Very few beans go in April. Starting to shift that. But one of the things about April, right, it's usually wetter, cooler. Maybe the fields don't work as well, So I've noticed anytime I've been in April planted fields, a little cloddier, things like that, and it's harder to get that uniform consistency. Now when you're putting in corn, 2.5, 2.25 inches, it's a little easier to get the down pressure consistent and all that, the closing wheels consistent. Beans though, sometimes on those early cloddy fields, I've got them at 0.75, 1, 1.25, 1.5 all over. It's harder to get uniform depth. I think there's a lot to be gained there. I don't have anything to show you on that, but things to consider: field conditions, soybean, and planting, getting off to the right start. No-till conventional, same depth. That's a good question. You do have to be careful, right? So the no-till may not dry out as fast, or warm up as fast. So I think probably want to be a little shallower if you're comparing a no-till to a conventional till, especially if you're going early. We don't want them sitting in the ground too long, but I've seen beans sit in the ground for 35 days and then come up and put 90 bushels out when they were planted super early. So, but yes, in general, you do have to watch that depth on those no-till because they don't warm up as fast, and maybe some residue that push through. So why I mentioned the April thing, and like I said, we're kind of catching on. So we went back and looked at this is 2012 to 2019, average yield of all of our trials based on the date it was planted, and then the yield, and you can see it's a decreasing trend, i.e. the later we plant, the lower the yield potential. And we average a decrease of about 0.5 bushel per acre per day. We were really excited. Sean Connolly, Wisconsin, has a very similar number, about 0.5 bushel per acre per day. Now, I think, yes, everyone kind of understands April beans are different than May beans. May beans are different than June beans. But 0.5 bushel per acre per day means 1 week is a 3.5 bushel difference in your yield potential. And so maybe those days in April, could we plant? Could we not plant? Maybe we start pushing that. And the other reason I like this, corn's a big baby, right? We don't want corn going to wet, cold soils. Soybean's tough. It handles it, pushes through. And it seems like we're getting fewer and fewer good, clean planting days and windows these years. So maybe on those earlier spring days that are maybe on the touch of marginal, we can maybe get those beans in and then not have to worry about getting those acres in later. But the decreasing trend is here. So then the question is, and like I said, a lot of the states used to this mid-May range, not so much on the early end. So anyone that's been doing May versus April beans, do you manage them differently? Or do you just treat them all the same? Should we be fertilizing early planted beans because they have a higher yield potential? Is fungicide more important? So we've been doing planting date studies the last 2 years, and we have a third year of the same thing this year. I'm not going to go through all of that data. I can, in general, tell you foliar protection for us, fungicide with insecticide, the last 2 years was worth 4 bushels, no matter what we did. April, early May, late May, or June planted soybean. Both years. And both last years were dry. So fungicide, even in a dry year, had about a 4 bushel advantage. This year, I would expect that to be a little higher with all the moisture we've had. Again, a lot of questions, right? Prices are going down. Should we start pulling those? I'm still on the foliar protection pass for this year. You got R3 beans. I'm still looking. I think fungicide is going to have the value this year. And it doesn't seem to be as related to planting date. Fertility is a little different. And this is where sometimes the total yield level versus the response to a management factor comes in. How many of you think your early April beans need fertilizer and your late May beans or June probably don't? Are we fertilizing all our acres? Are we fertilizing them at all, right? So one of the things we thought, early planted soybeans should be more responsive to fertility because it's cold and wet and the soil's not releasing it, right? And then in June or late May, the soils are warmed up, they're cycling it faster, and the soil's going to provide everything the bean needs. But when you plant April beans, they grow so slow. They're just stagnant. I mean, you go out a week later and it's like it hasn't changed. You go out 3 weeks later, oh, one more leaf here or there. My late May beans, out of the ground in 7 days, and they're putting out a leaf every couple days, they're growing so fast that the soil can't keep up with the nutrient need. So we are actually starting to see your late planted soybean has a better yield response to fertility than your early. Now, your early will still yield higher in the end, but the value of the input, and that's kind of the discussion we're going to have today. What did that input cost versus what it gave you, right? So I'll take a 10 bushel response on 50 bushel beans over a 3 bushel response on 75 bushel beans, right? I'll take the 75 bushel beans, but paying for 3 more bushels up there versus paying for 10 more bushels. So also just understanding if you're putting your inputs in, the value of the input versus the total yield level, things to consider on that end. But if you look at the soybean planting progress the last 2 years, you can see over time what percent of soybean acres are in, right? So by June, we're basically 100%. But 15th of May in 2022, only 40% of soybean had been planted in the state, which means 60% came after May 15th. Where our planting dates came in were here. So we had these 4 dates, pretty good spread. So we had 2 planting dates before half of the state, 2 planting dates after half of the state. This is what that looks like in the field. So we got out there April 23rd, May 9th, May 31st, or June 15th, starting to senesce ounce. And then we go look at the harvest and the yields after that. So what did it harvest? And I think you may have seen this if you heard me talk the last couple of years. There's the trend. It really closely matches that half bushel loss per acre per day. Early planted has a higher potential. But then we do it again, as anything in research, right? See it once, don't assume that you're always going to see it that way. So in 23, you'll notice 15th of May, we were almost 80% planted. So very different between the years, really dry year. Last year, I think it was some of the best soil conditions at planting because we were so dry in April. Got a lot of planting out early. We did manage to squeak 2 in on the first half of that end, and then the last 2 came in on the second half, where our data kind of goes in. Those reports are on our website. And then sure enough, planting later has a lower yield. But those that have good eyes, notice I've hidden something. And just to be proof, it doesn't always happen. So in this case, our first week of May was better than our second week of April. What was the cause? So did anyone have this in their fields last year? I don't know if you can see it. 9-10% beans with green leaves on them. And you zoom in on that. We had a lot of this. I actually can't tell you what's going on here. We really don't understand fully. But what it tells me is the plant had a lot of sugars, a lot of nitrogen, a lot of nutrition in the biomass. And then something came in, closed the seed off, and it had nowhere else to go when it does the remobilization. So what we think is we got some good conditions, and then during grain fill, something just stopped it, and we didn't have anywhere to move the rest of that nutrition. Saw this in almost all of our April beans. Anything I planted after April 20th was perfectly fine. So I don't know if anyone else had this issue last year. Going out there, your beans are 10%, but you got green leaves. They don't harvest as well, and we think it was harvest loss. It was part of that as well.
Does that correlate to purpling in corn?
So the question is purpling in corn on the early side?
I don't know.
So purpling in corn, we often see in the early vegetative, that's phosphorus because it's cold and wet, not growing fast enough, can't move sugars. I think it's a little different. I think this has something to do with we got the start and then something in the environment kind of came in and said no, kind of put us on our feet, on our butts, and cap that yield. But 73 is still pretty good, and it's only 5 less than that second one, and then within 2 or late May. But just to show, early beans is not a guarantee of the highest yield, but still better than that June planting. So that's just kind of the note on that. Going back though to building yield. Earlier planting, like I said, offers the higher potential, but it's not a guarantee. And I think that's the important thing too. Sometimes we, plant the beans and walk away, and we don't do much else after that. Or what I've seen the last 2 years, we get a year like this where either the weather turned bad or the prices turned bad, and we start giving up on the input. One of the things I think about corn and starter, right? We don't use much starter on soybean, but there's starter on corn, and you ever hear the phrase starter's not finisher? I have had a lot of starter fertilizer trials where we see growth response screaming out of the ground, starter's doing its job, it's looking better, it's looking stronger, and the yields come back flat to the no starter check. You give it a good start, you got to feed it all the way to the end, otherwise it crashes and burns. And this is any type of season management. And why I'm still recommending fungicide this year for the beans, because they think they got off to a great start, and we want to make sure we finish it through. So believe it or not, I was not a football player in high school. I used to run cross country. It's a 3-mile race, right? So if you sprint the first mile and skip the water table at that mile marker because you're feeling good and going through, by the time you get to mile 3, you're gassed, you're out of luck. But if you had taken that extra drink at the mile markers, you can finish through the end. That's like a season-long management. You get them out early, you get them to a good start, and then you got to finish on the back end to make it all come together. And I know sometimes that's really hard to convince yourself to do, is to put more into a crop when the prices are low, or maybe the weather is in June last 2 years was a big thing. I heard a lot of farmers said, pineapple, corn, flipped leaves in June, that crop's done. And then we got some phenomenal yields on some areas in the end. So I kind of just, I don't think this is a surprise. I don't think anything I've said so far today is news to anyone. It's just a little bit of a reminder on it. But one of the interesting things is when we start looking at maturity group. And this is where I said, start thinking about decisions for next year. So this is data that comes from a paper in 2018. There's a lot going on here, but on the left side is node number. So every line going up is number of nodes on that plant. And on the bottom is the date that they planted them. And so we can see, it's kind of like mine, right? Your April, your May, your June. Late beans put out less nodes. Early beans put out more nodes. And I brought some with me from our planting date this year. Right, and so these are my April beans. They're about 19 nodes today. These are my mid-May beans, and they're only at about 13. Now, they will put out more, but it's almost August. So the new nodes on these beans, how many of those are going to fully put out full pods? I'd rather have 19 nodes today. That means I got all of August to fill the pods. So earlier planting, more nodes, even if it's the same variety. And then this is where things get a little interesting. You'll notice there's different lines and different shapes of the different colors. So the color's the planting date, and then there's 4 varieties they did in this work. And what they saw was the longer the maturity group, you got an extra node or 2. So if you put out a longer maturity group, you can get another node. Another node is more pods is more seed, and I started the whole discussion today, more seed is driving yield than anything. So longer maturity group is more nodes, and then early planting is more nodes. So the early planting gives you the yield potential, and I think we can increase our maturity groups. Now I'm not saying go from a 3.5 to a 4.0, but what are we planting in here? Roughly, I know we got some people traveled today, but probably somewhere in the low 3s for those from the north up to maybe the late 3s in some areas. Is anyone pushing a 4.0? 4.1, 4.2? So one of the things for next spring maybe we consider is going up 0.2 maturity groups, right? Do everything else the same, all right? And I understand, different herbicide packages, different companies, every bag's different, but for the most part, a 3.5 from the same company with the same trait is going to be the same cost per bag as the 3.7. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think they're charging more for a longer maturity group, right? Now the companies are doing a really good job. I've got some early maturing beans in our trials that are awesome yielding, but in general, maybe we consider when you sit down with the dealer this winter, I want to go up 0.1, 0.2, and keep everything else the same. And this is where I think that potential is. And this gets back to same cost, maybe another 2 bushels or so. Our data is showing anywhere from 2 to 6 bushels for every 1 increase in maturity group. Now that'd be going from like a 3.0 to a 4.0, but I go from a 3.0 to a 3.3, maybe that's worth a bushel and a half. So some low-hanging fruit, I think. And just to show where some of that's coming from, here's our April versus May planting date on, this would have been June 15th in 2022 where these photos come from, compared to the May 9th to the May 31st. And then obviously this was the day we put our 4th planting date in. So planting that day, and that's your neighbor, right? We want to be there, or you want to be the neighbor, and then your neighbor's looking at you because they just planted theirs in. When you fast forward into the season, day like today almost, right? The first 2 planting dates are almost inseparable, but there's very clearly a difference between the early May and the late May. and the May 31st to the June 15th. And this comes back to the whole node discussion. When you separate these out on July 31st, and then we saw this last year, this year we're about 2 nodes behind of that year. Planting in April's 21 nodes at July 31st, 20 nodes for the second planting date, 17/12. Like I said, here's just the photographic evidence to what we talked about. This is where things get fun. We plant 140,000. That's where all my data is. That's our target. So if you have 140,000 plants with certain sets of nodes, how many nodes per acre do you have? Like I said, I avoided math as best I could, but sometimes you got to do the math. So by July 31st, April beans had almost 3 million nodes per acre, and then 2.8 million nodes for the second planting date. But you look at that June and late May, we're 2.4 and then 1.7 nodes going into the grain fill period. So if you planted in that June window, you would have had to plant 245,000 plants per acre to get the same number of nodes per acre. So early planting also means we can get away with maybe lower density and not have to pay as much on the seed input side as well.
Count the nodes on the land as well as the main stem?
No, so this is not including branch nodes. And if you have a lower density, you're more likely to branch, and it's probably going to be even higher.
Do they have value?
Do nodes on branches have value? Yes, the big branches, the main branches, will put pods on those. Will put pods on the branches as well. So this is something I think, right? Most of us are probably between 100 to 150, 160,000. Is anyone going below 100? Right. So below 100, we had we put in beans 3 years ago on April 2nd, and they got cold and frosted. Our final stand was 65 to 75. And they still pulled north of 80 bushels because they branched, because they had all that elbow room. We'll talk a little bit on, and as I go into the harvest side, but they had thick stems, so harvestability is a big factor there. But early beans, lower density, still maintain nodes because they'll branch. And so speaking of planting density, what's the general rule of thumb? The later you plant, the more you should plant, right? This is where it comes from. Here's just some data we had from 2020. We did 3 densities, 80,000, 140, or 200. We had a 3-4 across the state. We did match that. Would like to go longer in the south and shorter in the north maybe. But I'm putting $80 a bag, and then I did this math at $10 per bushel based on some of today's prices potential. Means you needed about 3.4 bushels to make that 60,000 plant per acre cost pay back for itself, right? So what those yields were across the state, so everyone understand, 3 densities, 3 different locations, what the value was at each of those sites in yield, but then you put the asterisk next to the ones that were most economical. And really, I don't think we need to be doing much more than to 140, 150, 60,000, unless we're really pushing into late May, early June. And so 80 to 140,000, 80,000 seeds per acre at our northern site was the most economical, and still pretty tight there. Wasn't much yield gain. So that's kind of what we see. So the message here is more isn't always better. You can maybe get by with less seed per acre and still have good yields there. So increasing maturity group can maybe get you more nodes, but then I think higher planting density is not always needed. So that might be an area, your seed dealer won't like that, but you can maybe cut back population a little bit. Maybe if you're at 160, we try 140. If we're at 140, 120. Now, obviously, if you drop any less than that, you're hoping they all come up. So understanding that part of the equation as well. Seed treatment then, right? So you guys will get a shot to tell Jennifer I'm still using AJ's photos from his seed treatments. I mean, I'm a big fan of seed treatment, especially if you're planting early. That's on the pest management side. But one of the things I did want to talk about was other seed treatments. Is anyone inoculating their beans? So we know soybean fixes in through nodules. We pick them up. Everyone know the general rule of thumb, how many pounds of nitrogen it takes to produce a bushel of corn? 0.9, 1. The old outdated agronomy value would be, of textbook would say 1.2. We'll just do easy math. 1 pound of N to get 1 bushel of corn. How many pounds of N to produce 1 bushel of soybean? 3 to 4 pounds, right? So per bushel, soybean needs more nitrogen. Why we're not pouring the nitrogen on the soybean is because of the whole N fixation. So it's getting half its N from the nodules and about half from mineralization. So can we then enhance the nodules with some alternative seed treatment strategies? This is what we're kind of looking at. Seed treatment, for the most part, everything's pretty low cost input. It's not a very expensive input, especially compared to some of the herbicides, fungicides, and foliar packages. So what could we do on seed treatment side? That's where some of the things get kind of fun and exciting. I've done bradyrhizobium work. It's like 50-50 plus or minus 1.5 bushels. We just don't see the consistency in a rotated ground because there's enough natural out there. So are there strategies to increase soybean inoculation, but not through our traditional routes? One of the areas we're looking at, apologize that jump there, molybdenum on the seed or different types of microbes. So bradyrhizobium is what we know does that work. We're trying things like azospirillum, some of these new biological products out there. Where the molybdenum, has anyone talked to them about molybdenum seed treatments? So that whole N fixation process in those nodules needs molybdenum to work. So this approach is, rather than put the microbes on the seed, put the tools the microbes need on the seed, and then the microbes can go to work. So we're doing molybdenum seed treatment versus a bradyrhizobium inoculant. What we're doing, we are looking at nodules. We remove the nodules. This is a good work if you got anyone that needs a good day on the farm, nothing to do. Have them go dig nodules and start plucking them off the roots. We've been doing, different measurements to them, but then we size them out, take them for weight, basically total weight, how much nodules per plant, and then in their theory of more nodules, then they have more nitrogen and then higher yield on that end. I'm just going to do the math here. So if you look at the weight, it's in milligrams there, but all of our treatments had a higher total nodule biomass weight. But it's not a bradyrhizobium inoculum. So it's not like we put more microbes. It's just we gave them tools and they were able to do it better, and those nodules were bigger, healthier, and more active. And then that translated to yield response anywhere from 1 to 2 bushels. All right, now 1 to 2 bushels is not exciting, especially if you're talking corn, but for the cost of those seed treatments, even in a $10 bean market, that pays for itself. And so I like alternative seed treatments as a potential for a low risk, modest reward if we still want to push for yields, but without breaking the bank too much. So, and then like I said, if we're increasing yield, we're likely increasing seed number. That's where the increases come from. Better nodulation, more nitrogen to go around, more pods retained. So any questions on molybdenum seed treatment? And then those azospirillum seem to be working as well, but not quite as good as the molybdenum.
Why do soybeans have the ability to fix nitrogen and corn don't?
So the question is, why does soybean fix N, but corn does not? It's in the genetic background. So they have the genes to do that, to make the communication. Corn can't communicate. They've tried, the breeders have tried. Can we get corn to do that? There's too many switches, and you start crossing wires, and it just doesn't work on a yield level. So corn, not genetically hardwired. It's not in its DNA to do that. But soybean does. This is why Proven 40, Envita, Utrisha, these are all N-fixing products for corn that are not nodules. So it's trying to make this work for corn in a different approach. Happy to talk about that later here. But it's one of those things I'm thinking, just give the microbes the tools they need. And molybdenum seed treatment is something I think that we're really interested in. Here's another trial we did, and I put the actives on there because there's thousands of products out there these days in the biological market. I highly recommend, maybe ignore the name on the front of the jug. Turn around and look at the active ingredient. That'll tell you a lot. Here's just a shout out. If they don't list an active ingredient, don't buy it, because I don't even know if the sales rep knows what's in it. So I went on a few websites, tried to find what's in some of these products, and it's nowhere to be found. There should be an active ingredient on there, but you can see we've got some bradyrhizobium, that's your traditional standard, but then some of these bacillus type things that we're looking in. And this is just that nodule biomass. Again, everything seems to be increasing nodule over. CST is just commercial seed treatment, your pesticides there. But what was interesting is where we had straight Brady rhizobium. There was no advantage, almost a bushel loss. Any of these alternative inoculum is anywhere from 0.3 to 1.1 bushels. So it wasn't exciting data, but it kind of hit home. Traditional Brady rhizobium in our Illinois soils, they're just naturally there. So can we put something else on there, like a partner for those, and try and just make them do their job a little better? So I'm really interested, and I think it's an area worth trying, some of the alternative seed treatment for soybean, or like a micronutrient seed treatment. So a higher planting density, not always needed, was there, and then novel seed treatments might be low input costs. So everything I've kind of talked about and just kind of highlighted, that's how we build the yield. And then the rest of the conversation, I kind of want to go back and forth. What questions do you have? Where are we going? But also, what should we focus on moving forward? And it goes back to Stephanie's title here, maintaining yield strategies among the low commodity prices. Planter settings, right? 1.5, certainly not afraid. I'm not that afraid of 2-inch beans. Stephanie might challenge me on that. But obviously clays versus sands, things like that. Got to consider that, crusting. But I'm not afraid of putting my beans a little deeper. Maybe drop it a 1/4 inch from what you typically do when you run the settings, especially if you're going extra early. And then this one, anyone that's heard Aaron Hager, right, knows weed management, water hemp, it's a problem. I get that. And I know that herbicides aren't cheap. And especially those premixes where they have a little bit of everything in there, those are really not cheap. But one of the things that I think is sometimes hard to remember, right? I get it. At the end of the year, we calculate the books for that season. But understanding what we do this year influences next year and influences next year. And sometimes we need to think on a 3 to 5 year plan. And weed management, like I said, I'm on the high yield side. For us, weed management's a must. It's a prerequisite to high yield. And when we're talking about prioritizing our inputs, right, on soybean especially, I would take, if you're doing any fertility, make sure if we need to put out of the fertility jar and put it into our herbicide management plan, that's going to save you. Because also remember, every escape you have in your field has now increased the pressure for the next year. And that increases the pressure for the next year. So do not overlook the value of that second post-emerge if you have to. If you got to host a family barbecue.
The yield loss of E or R3 putting on either Liberty or 2,4-D or combination, what's the yield loss?
So the question is, what's the yield loss on if you're doing like an R3 post with Liberty or 2,4-D?
Along with fungicide.
With fungicide, I don't have any data on that. I think we're starting to push off label maybe on some of that for stage. So unfortunately, I'm bound by if it's not on label, we can't do that. But you do risk interference with flowering and pot abortion if you stress it too much at R3. So those labels are important. One of the things we're doing our first pass post pass pretty early, V2, and then we're doing like another V6 post before we start flowering. And that's what it takes to have control in our research plots, but it's working. An early followed by a standard post. That's also with a pretty intensive pre. But I know it's hard, but I think where we need to put the dollars is weed management, because anything you do to increase yield is just wasting the dollars if we have something taking yield away, and that'd be weed pressure. There's a student, this is just, it's not a massive study or anything, but they had a weed science study last year in corn. I don't have his bean data. They had 3% weed coverage in the field. So 3% of the ground was escapes. And they had a 15% yield loss on the corn. So it's not a 1-to-1 either. It's not 1% of weed escape is 1% yield loss. It was 3% of weed escape was a 15% yield loss. And then those were able to produce seed for the next year. So weed management, I know it's tough, but that's where I'm going to prioritize. And then I'm still on the R3 fungicide for this year. I've been getting that question a lot this year. Do you pull that or not? Especially if you got beans looking like this out here this time of year. So
I think it'd be interesting to take some of his comments. Well, I guess full disclosure, we sell See and Spray and selective spray systems, but it would be interesting because part of, I don't care if it's deer, green eye, bilberry, whoever's doing it claims that we keep dinging beans with either basically anything that you're going to put out there during reproductive phases. So they're claiming herbicide savings. Well, I can tell you right now, herbicide savings in our part of the world is not going to pay for one of those systems. And I sell them. But when we start eliminating broadcast spraying that's dinging the whole field as versus to dinging it right around that water hemp plant, there may be some real gains there.
Part of people tell me that 2,4-D is worse, and part of them tell me Liberty's worse.
So I don't have anything to say, you know, what's worse at the flowering stages, Liberty or 2,4-D. Liberty's, you know, immediate flash and can cause some stress, whereas 2,4-D, because it works slower, the plant may have time to metabolize it. But I can't say which is worse. But the see and spray is an interesting area because you will save on total product for that. And then the value, like I said, just a few escapes has a big yield penalty on it. So see and spray might change some of that where you are only hurting certain spots. I just don't see it yet on broad enough acres. I don't know if we have the specific numbers behind it, but see and spray is coming a long way and it's moving fast. So definitely worth mentioning. Those technologies are coming through, and they're getting better and they're getting a little cheaper as they come out too. So then the last thing, like I said, before we just kind of transition to discussion, Q&A, like I said, I just threw some slides together of things I thought was important reminders, why we do what we're doing. I've seen too many green fields in November the last 2 years that were not cover crops. Harvest loss. I mean, if anything, you want to maximize yields and profitability, don't leave the beans in the field. Everyone know the general rule of thumb, how many kernels per square foot is a bushel lost for corn? It's 2, right? Does anyone know the soybean number for that? How many soybeans per square foot is a bushel lost? It's 3 to 4. So all it is 3 to 4 seeds in a square foot, you've lost a bushel per acre just from harvest loss. And this is where some of the things that I start thinking about, how old are your sickles? How's that sickle bar cutting? Especially if you're at 100,000 or less, those stems are this big. If you can't cut them cleanly, it's going to shake the tree and then the beans pop out. So really pay close attention to your stands. And when you go into harvest, understand if you have low population areas, that you're probably going to need to change a little bit on how you run the header, the speed, and make sure that our sickles are sharp so we can get a clean cut. I run a research combine way too slow, and I hate running research combines because it goes so slow. But I've seen in our low-density plots the low-density beans shake like trees, and then the beans start popping before they even get in. So that's something to be watching, something to keep an eye on. If you got some time as we go into dry down, double-check all of your cutter bars and things like that. Make sure we're going to get clean cut. Get as many beans in through the head rather than shaking them off before they even get there. Every field is different, and especially here, you guys got after it early. You're going to have, I think, into the fields a lot earlier than parts of the state. Take advantage of that time. I know it's nice getting it done, or if you're in cover crop, get it out so we can get the cover crop in. I know there's some wheat still in this area, things like that. I get that, and you don't always guarantee how many days are dry versus wet. But that extra 10 to 15 minutes at every field to just walk behind the first few passes and make sure it's set, I think is some of the lowest hanging fruit to optimizing profitability for this year.
I'm 2 hours south of here, but we see a lot of variability in maturity in beans, and there's more talk of it all the time of using defoliants. And we sell drones too, so if you got areas of fields that are actually doing it, have you actually done any research on that?
So the question is on using defol to get it more consistent across there. Don't see much of that in Illinois. I know there's a lot of it down southern states. There's a lot of research being done. Gosh, I'm going to blank on this. Mississippi State has a lot of desiccation work. And there can be value there if there's a huge range in maturity. Like I said, the beans where we lost that yield on those April beans, I'm wondering if a desiccant would have made them feed through. I'm pretty convinced that I lost yield because they weren't feeding through right, not because they weren't on the bean plant to begin with. So desiccants is definitely something of discussion, but I had no personal experience with that. Especially though if you've got green patches and areas that are almost ready to shatter, yeah, maybe if we can even that up. Challenge there, how late you wait, because if you drive through it too late, then you start knocking pods off. But happy to take any other questions, I don't know, or feedback, right? If you're interested in what I was, or Anything you'd rather hear different days? Yes.
You mentioned R3 fungicide. Do you feel like insecticide with that as well? Or no?
For the cost of insecticide and what you're paying for the application, we're generally throwing fungicide with insecticide, yes. Especially, I'm hearing this is the year of the insects. Stephanie, you've covered a lot more ground than I have this year, but I mean, we had a really mild winter. We didn't really get a hard freeze. Insect pressure this year, I think, is higher than it has been in the last few years. So, yes, this year I would say foliar protection is fungicide with insecticide at that R3 stage.
So I've had several growers that plant super early. So when I say probably too early, but mid-March or so, and we have had frosts across the state the last 2 years. There are some guys and gals experimenting with planting super deep, like up to 3 inches. What are your thoughts on that? And actually, I saw it last year, but just one observation where they actually, I mean, it slowed it up so much, it did miss the frost.
So Stephanie said she's hearing people putting 3-inch beans in March. And I've been tempted to try something like that because I've had a third week of March, spring break, right? All the students are gone. So I got time to actually go look at fields, right? And it's like, oh, this is plantable. Like the conditions are there, we're dry. Do you do it or not? Anecdotal, I would say if you are going 3 inches deep, seed treatment, please. Probably, definitely in March. Plausible. Now, this gets into soil types, right? So the more clay you have, things like that, where you risk maybe more crusting, maybe you don't go 3 inches, but plausible. I mean, I can see that going through. Like I said, I'm not afraid to put soybean in any of our plots at any plant date at 2 inches. Like I said, Sam didn't speak to me for 2 weeks until they came up. I'd like to do it in research, but, you know, don't put the whole farm in maybe, but also look at seed size. I don't know how many pay attention to the seed size on the bags when they show up in the shop every spring. Right? This year, I don't think I've seen a wider range in seed size in our variety trials. I mean, I had 3,000 seed per pound. I had one come in at 1,700 seed per pound. I mean, just massive. Those seed feed through the planter differently, right? So we're checking settings. If we're changing varieties from field to field, don't assume that the variety will plant the same as it did in the last field because you got to check the seed size. And that's part of this climate variability, things like that. Seed production's tough, and to get that same consistent seed size is not easy. And so corn and beans, I have seen, I think, the widest range of just seed size coming in the bag. That changes everything about how it goes in the ground. And like I said, that's where everything starts.
What do you like for survivability, though?
So the question is, what do you like about survivability? I don't have enough personal experience to maybe, you know, say this seed size is best for certain scenarios, but especially if you're early and going deep, I mean, a bigger seed has a little more energy reserve, might be able to live out a little longer. If you are a smaller seed, maybe don't go as deep, so they do get a chance to get out of the ground, things like that. So these are things that we need to be thinking about that we maybe don't always consider, or in the heat of the moment, it's got to go, got to get it in. Rain's going to come in 2 days. I get that part as well. It's easy for me to tell you, you know, these are everything you need to consider, and then sit there and planting time comes around, and we got to make a lot of decisions quickly.
How do you lower the carbon score on your beans?
So the question is, how do you lower the carbon score on beans? I'm just going to straight up say I have not been following that as best I can because I think it changes every week. But yeah, the carbon markets is something I'm going to probably pass on for today. And the new one I am seeing, though, is now nitrogen credits. So there's all this stuff in carbon, and now they're saying, we're going to go focus on nitrogen credits because they're more potent, things like that. But understand that the carbon intensity is coming and probably going to be mandated here at a certain point.
In-season fertility.
So the question is for in-season fertility. Thinking foliar feeds? Yep. So some thoughts on that. I think it's warranted. We're dabbling with some things like boron, zinc, molybdenum, manganese, some of these packages. We're seeing anywhere from 2 to 3, 4, 5 bushel yield bumps. One of the interesting things on in-season foliar feed that I've seen, the higher your yield potential, the more you can get out of it. I have a field down in southern Illinois. No matter what I do to it, it's 50 bushel beans. Whether I do nothing or do everything, it's 50 bushel beans. You know those fields, you know those spots. Now, the bean fields that can push 65 plus, those tend to be more responsive. It's a little counterintuitive, right? I've already got high yielding ground. Can it do much more? It's almost like it's asking for what more it can do. So first thing I would say, if you're doing some more intensive in-season stuff, your higher yield ground tends to be more responsive in the data sets we've been seeing. It's harder to bring lower yielding ground up. Sometimes the soils are just there. Boron, molybdenum, manganese, and those are the three that we are seeing some positive yield bumps to. We do have a tissue testing project sponsored by Soybean Association, which means the checkoff dollars. We are reevaluating how accurate is the tissue test recommendations and is our current recommendation the best approach. This came from a question, which leaf do we sample? The most recently mature, because it's the new growth. But anyone pulls a soybean plant up right now, what do you got? Flowers at the top and a pod this long at the bottom, starting to already fill. So do you think what's going on at the top of the plant is the same as what's going down at the bottom? Nope. New technology, new sprayer, new undercovers. What we're looking at is what's happening in the top versus the lower, and then maybe we'll find certain nutrients could be undercovered at R3 to get the developing pods at the bottom, and then maybe a different nutrient package should go over the top. So we're looking into that stuff, but yeah, general rule on foliar feed, the micros seem to be having a good play, and it tends to be better on our high yielding ground than what our data would show.
Is there a cover crop system that soybeans, cover crop species or system that soybeans tend to prefer? And then I'm just going to throw in the sulfur question after that.
So the question is on cover crop systems, and Abigail might have a better answer for that. So the question is there a system that you see that soybean maybe better prefers, right? Cereal rye or a blend, or what might you suggest is the best cover crop program for soybean?
Luckily, soybeans are very adaptable, and they grow out of some concrete and they'll grow anywhere. So we usually recommend a first season of cover crops to be on a soybean rotation. The simplest form is cereal rye. So keeping it easy, it'll overwinter. We're not as far north over here, but you can have some harsh winters where if you put a cover crop out and you put something in that doesn't overwinter very well with the harsh winter, that's where'd your money go? So we recommend cereal rye first off. And then to get a little bit more advanced, it has been shown some of the brassicas to start to suppress certain things. It's still being researched. There still needs to be some more clear representation if it actually is causing suppression, but brassicas overall are a good option. And then, when we talk about corn, it's a lot more opportunities to play around with your clovers. Winter camelina, I saw in soybeans this year. It's a good overwintering. It's kind of near the rape family. So rape and winter camelina are two mixes that we see commonly with cereal rye that have that overwintering factor that it will come back. We have real struggle with overwintering. Anything that gets too small seeded. Annual ryegrass. Has anyone tried annual ryegrass before? That's something that sometimes is a hit and miss with overwintering, can be a struggle on termination if you don't follow the right protocol. So we talk about a lot of the grasses. Cereal rye number one, we look into barley and triticale. Triticale, if you remember, hybrid between rye and wheat. So some like triticale, but over here you have more cattle, so you kind of know sometimes your triticale prices fall under the forage category, and they can move that up a little bit. It's interesting when you talk about cover crops. I've been hearing a lot of guys that it got too far this spring, whether that was you planted your corn first, let that grass grow for the cover crop on your soybean acres, but then your soybeans you planted late, which means your cover crops got a little taller than you wanted to, and actually leaf size. So there's different varieties of cereal rye, and so Elbon, and others that you can look into, and so that means you could probably reduce the population and still get quite a bit of biomass, and it's all with the goal. So when we talk about the next phases of what you're wanting to look into for different species, what's your goal? Do you have weed pressure? Are you concerned about diseases, SCN? Do you have compaction? What soil types are you on? That's where we can really look into what species you pick to what goal problem you want to solve. Erosion, things like that. So it wasn't a fair answer as an agronomist would give you.
And that's what we hear too. Cereal rye seems to be a good way to start. There was a sulfur follow-up to that. So Sean Castillo at Purdue does a lot of work on soybean. His general rule, what he's seeing is later planted soybean is sulfur responsive, early is not. It's the opposite of what I said. But what we're seeing is more on the P and K side. So P and K early and not so much, or P and K late on that end. He's seeing the sulfur on the early side because of the availability. Sulfur and nitrogen move differently than things like phosphorus and potassium, so you probably do need more of that up front, whereas his late beans aren't as responsive to sulfur. We've been dabbling with ammonium sulfate, hit or miss. My best ammonium sulfate response was at my higher yielding site, i.e. that site was limited by nitrogen and sulfur, and we could take 85 bushel to 90 bushel beans. My 50 bushel site was still 50 bushels. So sulfur, we had 3 years of AMS in that scenario and saw the same thing. It worked in our northern site, it didn't work down south. We're dabbling with ATS. We've wide dropped it on soybean, minor bump. We're doing about 20 pounds, so 7 gallons of ATS. One of the interesting things, right, tank mixes, we're dabbling with ATS in our cover crop trials, and it's working really well, but it burns the cover crop almost overnight, and you get some kill issues. So do be aware if you're doing ATS in cover crop systems, tank mix, like the Roundup, if you burn the cover crop before the Roundup moves into the growing points, that cereal rye grows right back. So keeping an understanding of that.
Ammonium sulfate? ATS, what's that?
Yeah, ATS is ammonium thiosulfate. So it's a 7002021, I think. It's a liquid ammonium with sulfate in there, but slightly different analysis on the broadcast. But yeah, so I really like ATS, but if you're tank mixing in cover crop type scenarios or burn down scenarios, just do be careful. You may lose some of the herbicide efficacy. And like I said, right now, I think the number one thing we need to make sure we're on top of is weed management. Any other questions? I think, Stephanie's got some stuff to show, and then if we still have time before we move on to dinner, happy to keep the conversation going. Big things, like I said, as we finish out this season, do please check behind the combine, and not just the first field, the second field, but to the 10th, 12th, whatever many fields we got, all the way to the end, because it will change. And I know it's easy, 2 fields left, we'll just get it done, right? But you could leave some bushels on the ground and fly through it. So keep an eye on that. Harvest loss last 2 years across the state has been more than I'd like to see. Going into next spring, look at seed size, planter settings, depth. Consider some of those. And like I said, I think one of the easiest things to do is go up a 0.1 or 0.2 on maturity group when you meet with your dealer this year. I think there's some potential value there with little risk. All right, I'll hand it over to Stephanie, and then I'm not going to duck out of here, so I'll be around.